So we're looking now, we looked at the rhetoric, language, and media coverage. Let's move to where hateful words have led to hateful actions. We know that the distance between hate rhetoric and hate conduct is only a matter of opportunity. So how does it manifest itself?
Well, what we've found is that a favorite time to launch anti-Semitic and Hinduphobic attacks is during Jewish and Hindu holidays. Here are campaigns that appropriate sacred holidays and festivals to make political statements. So speaking of college campuses, let's talk to a college student about her experiences with anti-Semitism. We're witnessing pressure and ostracizing of Jewish and Hindu students to reject their national origin, to reject their religious selves, an assault on their pride, as I heard someone describe it.
Let me introduce Becca Powers. She is a Stand With Us Emerson Fellow at Ohio State University and a remarkable woman. Her last name aptly describes her powers. She's quite powerful. Rebecca, do you want to tell us a little bit about your experience on campus?
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much for including me in this presentation. Some of the similarities between the Hindu and Jewish community are new, but some of them I've actually been taught about during Ohio State's annual Hanukkah and Diwali Festival of Light celebration through Buckeyes for Israel and Hillel, which I've enjoyed every year. A little bit about me. I'm a third year at The Ohio State University, and I grew up in a Jewish household going to synagogue and have been to Israel twice. I also grew up guided by Jewish values instilled by my family, and specifically my grandmothers, who are very dear to my heart. I started my journey in high school by taking leadership roles in Israel clubs and Jewish youth groups. And senior year, I did the Stand With Us high school internship. However, I never knew how involved I would be and what I would run into in college. I started out with a great advantage with Israel knowledge because of this background. Last year, I became involved in various Israel and Jewish organizations and additionally became a member of the undergraduate student government at The Ohio State University. Unfortunately, in the spring of 2022, BDS, an anti-Israel and historically anti-Semitic resolution, came to the General Assembly. Dozens of Jewish, Israeli, and allied students gave speeches about the harm BDS propagates within our community, and Palestinian students gave their narrative about how the Israeli government harms their families. But I never thought I would run into rhetoric such as hearing from students that Zionism is racism, that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, implying that there is no space for the Jewish people between the Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea, which essentially constitutes all of Israel. I never thought I would hear that Zionism is terrorism, or people and professors screaming intifada on campus, a term that is a revolutionary time period for Palestinians, but for Jews and Israelis is a horrible time period where thousands of Israelis died in terror attacks and is extremely scary for our community. Someone who wasn't part of our community actually read the definition of anti-Semitism that suited her and that she liked, not a Jewish community agreed upon definition. So essentially, she was trying to tell us what was anti-Semitism and what wasn't. And this year, several anti-Semitic stickers and rhetoric have been posted everywhere on campus, as you can see from these photos that were actually taken on the campus of The Ohio State University. These really made me question my identity. It had me thinking, was Zionism racism? Am I a bad person for believing in Zionism? Was everything that I learned a lie? This feeling of discomfort made me sick to my stomach. And if questioning my national identity could happen to me with my education, what about other students who had been less prepared? But I decided to fight, to learn, and to educate others. Moving forward, fortunately, I was surrounded by a community that helped me understand what Zionism is and the beauty of the concept that allows it to be subjective to the person. Zionism to me is the belief that the Jewish people have the right to and need for Jewish national self-determination in some portion of our ancestral homeland in the land of Israel. From there, I made the decision that I wanted to innovate and expand activism and education for the Jewish and Israeli community at Ohio State's campus. Firstly, I decided I wanted to go back to my roots, back to the Stand With Us family for their Emerson program to continue learning and cultivating my skills. Secondly, I was offered the Senior Director of Operations position within the undergraduate student government, and I took it to ensure Jewish students would be represented on a university level and to advocate for IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And I also advocated for anti-Semitism trainings to be implemented on a university level, in which IRA was instituted by the Board of Trustees, and anti-Semitism training will be implemented in the spring. Additionally, I've become the president of Buckeyes for Israel and Tamid, and I've put on several events to bring together over 300 students and communities to educate them on Jewish and Israeli culture and history, and to celebrate our culture together. Thank you again so much for having me here. If anyone is interested in speaking more, feel free to contact me. And if you teach or attend The Ohio State University, message me and I'd be glad to connect. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone may have as well. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you, Becca, for what you've done, what you're doing, and what I know you will continue to do. I'm so glad that you're on our side. So we see students being pressured to deny their national origin. And there's also movement for destruction or conversion when it morphs from words to action. Now, conversion is not that common a pressure on Jews. I think most people have given up on trying to convert us. It didn't work out well. But there's a lot of focus on destruction. So anti-Semitism mutated from hating the individual Jew and calling for his or her death to hating the Jewish state and advocating for its destruction. Now, before, Jews had to justify their reason to exist. Now, people expect Israel to justify its existence. Nobody has to justify their existence. But from Palestinian Authority school book maps and later maps by more conventional institutions, many don't include Israel. Last week, the United Nations General Assembly voted to commemorate May 15th, Israel's Independence Day, to Nakba Day. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. A nation whose birth is an international catastrophe? What does that mean? It isn't worthy of existence? So how has your experience been for the Hindu community with conversion, destruction?
Why, the destruction in many ways, conversion is destruction, because as you get people to turn away from their heritage, from their way of life, it has a fundamental impact on the individual. Once the individual is changed, it breaks down the family. When it breaks down the family, it breaks down the community. And when it breaks down the community, it breaks down a nation or an ethos. Even though India is a secular republic, certainly there's an ethos that has come about as a result of the indigenous traditions, like Hinduism and other dharmic traditions. So I talked about the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference, which at the end of the conference, they were asking for the dismantling of global Hinduism. And that comes from more of a Marxist mindset, an anti-religious mindset. But we also see calls for the dismantling or destruction of Hinduism theologically. So there's a concept called Ghazwa-e-Hind, and this goes back to a hadith, which prophesizes that there's a great battle in India between true believers and unbelievers, which are Hindus, before the end of times. This has infused South Asia with importance as a battleground in an effort to establish a caliphate. So you have groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, two Pakistan-based terror groups that cite Ghazwa-e-Hind as a means of liberating Kashmir and other areas, well, the whole country of India. We also have something called the Great Commission. So what you see on the far right is a map of what is described as unreached people. This is an initiative called the Joshua Project. I've oftentimes joked that the Joshua Project could probably deliver mail a lot more efficiently than most postal services of any country, with the amount of precision they have about people and people groups. So the Great Commission harkens back to Matthew 28, verses 16 through 20, which is interpreted as a command to preach the gospel to all nations of the world. So this effort has billions of dollars coming from primarily the United States being poured into evangelizing non-Christians, not just in India, but what's also broadly called the 1040 window, which is where the largest populations of non-Christians are. And each zip code, the goal is to plant a church and eventually take over the religious identities of those regions.
Oh my goodness, attack by zip code. So this next slide is particularly concerning to me because it's denying or destroying our history, artifacts of history, and denying history. This has been a very powerful tool of anti-Semites. Now, it started with the destruction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem when the Romans were exasperated with the Jewish refusal to accept their gods, and they reduced their holiest site, the temple, to rubble, and they renamed the land Philistia after the Philistines, a long defeated enemy of Israel. It was an attempt to erase any connection of Jews to the land, but we stayed there anyway. We see this again and again during the illegal Jordanian occupation of eastern Jerusalem from 48 to 67. 58 synagogues, some so ancient and of historic value, were destroyed and desecrated. Jordan built a road through the ancient Jewish cemetery on the Mount of Olives. They used the tombstones from the cemetery for building projects, including latrines. They let the western wall of the temple deteriorate. And during the Six-Day War, they used the Temple Mount as an ammunition dump. We find these cases of vandalism, historic vandalism and destruction of so many Jewish holy sites. Just last April, dozens of Palestinian rioters violated Joseph's tomb, a holy place. They broke the tombstone on the grave. They set fires to the room in the compound. Denying and destroying historical sites and history are designed to deny any Jewish claims to the land or heritage. Denying history is denying destiny.
That's right. And we see that for the Hindu community as well. Popular amongst activist scholars is to refer to India as settler colonial, as in the context. Oh, it's also white adjacent. We also are white adjacent.
I just have to say, the first time I heard you say that we were together and I was sitting at a table with all Hindus, you said you're white adjacent. I thought racism knows no bounds and never uses any of the senses to see or hear reality.
No, exactly. So settler colonial is, there's a long history of it, but I'll just talk about it in the context of Kashmir. So settler colonialism is, by definition, the destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures in order to replace them and establish themselves as the new rightful inhabitants. Well, under this definition, if India was occupying Kashmir as a settler colonial state, it would be displacing the indigenous population, which are Kashmiri Pandits or Kashmiri Hindus, except that they've already been displaced. By who? By a proxy terror war that's been ongoing, sponsored by the Republic of Pakistan. So Hindus indigenous to the Kashmir Valley, known as Kashmiri Pandits, were the original inhabitants of Kashmir and have a unique ethno-religious culture that dates back more than 5,000 years. And they've suffered 7 ethno-religious cleansings, the latest in 1989. So that's a good example of denying history. And I'd also like to talk about destroying history. So iconoclasm under Mughal rule led to the destruction or desecration of thousands of dharmic temples, not just Hindu temples, but Sikh, Jain, and Buddhist temples. Materials were destroyed, left in ruins, used to construct Islamic structures. Some of these mosques continue to stand directly on top of destructed temples. So the 2 images that I wanted to share with the audience are of 2 mosques and the temples that Hindus believe they kind of replaced that have been the subject of court cases. So Hindus have taken their hopes for justice to the Indian courts. And so the first one, or the one to the right, the black and white photo, is Gyan Vyapi, and that is the subject of current litigation. There are historical records of multiple demolitions of Hindu temples on this spot that were to the Hindu deity Shiva. And most recently, the court ordered an excavation to see if indeed artifacts from a Hindu temple were in the basement of what outwardly looks like a mosque. And then the picture in the middle is of Babri Masjid. Now, what happened with the Babri Masjid is it had been in court, the issue had been in the courts for decades, well over 50 years. And at one point, there was a demonstration outside of it, and Hindus were at a protest, and the protest went violent, and the mosque was torn down. We don't condone that sort of violence. The courts should have been given a chance to come to a fair and just ruling based on the evidence. Since that time, however, the India Supreme Court did rule that there had indeed been a temple. And so I just want to read a quote from the press release we released on the day of the Supreme Court's ruling. And I said, quote, "Today's ruling by the Indian Supreme Court is equally a victory for Hindus and Muslims, as it is for archaeologists, historians, and the Indian legal system. Hindus will finally get a temple, and Muslims will get a mosque in Ayodhya. While HAF unequivocally denounces the violence that arose in the tearing down of the Babri Masjid, permission to rebuild a Hindu temple on the site of Ram Janmabhoomi delivers both justice and closure to a deep and historic wound." So this is a complicated issue. You have a number of places that are deeply sacred, and it was for that precise reason that temples there were torn down. And so, really the solution to these things is, of course, the legal process, but also talking about these issues. Denying history and brushing it under the rug does nothing to help towards healing.
Once you start with denying history, you can deny not only history and our connection to the land and religion, but then you can deny our pain. Despite the fact that the Holocaust was one of the most documented events in human history, and it was documented by the Germans themselves, Holocaust denial and distortion spread the false idea that we Jews invented or exaggerated the Holocaust. When I hear that, I think, well, what happened to 182 of my family members? Where did they just go? On the photo on the left, you'll see that Iran holds an annual Holocaust cartoon contest to mock the idea that there was a Holocaust. And they do this while they and other anti-Semites deny the Holocaust and while they're promoting a new Holocaust. We see also what's called Holocaust inversion, and it attributes Nazi characteristics to contemporary Jews. That all of a sudden, we are not the victims, we're the perpetrators. And we often see on college campuses and elsewhere, the Jews and Israel are compared with the Nazis. And it's, again, the insanity in a logic of hate. But while saying we are Nazis, claiming at the same time that there was no Holocaust by Nazis. But it is equally dangerous to deny history and deny, it's double killing people. It's killing them once in the attack and then attempting to kill their memory.
That's right. And, you know, in the Hindu context, scholars of the media actively do this sort of denial of genocide or atrocities, saying things like, yes, Hindus were killed, but not as many as right-wing Hindus claim. So using things like right-wing or nationalist to somehow diminish oftentimes what are documented facts. And so I have an image of a story that covered a notification that we received from Pakistan's Telecommunication Authority, Web Analysis Division. And it was a demand for us to take down a section of our website that sought to bring light to the 1971 Bengali Hindu genocide. This is a genocide that left 2 to 3 million people dead, about 200 to 400,000 women that were raped in rape camps, and 10 million people who were displaced, most of them Hindu. Now, the claim by Pakistan, which was instrumental for those who may not know this history, we had East and West Pakistan. West Pakistan basically was culturally, linguistically very different. And so they sought to have independence and won that war. Today it's Bangladesh, but the atrocities were committed by the Pakistan government. So there is the height of irony that we have a Pakistan authority telling an American institution, by the way, that our site was disseminating content that sought to ridicule or defame the armed forces of Pakistan. No, we just sought to tell the truth and to remember the lost and celebrate survival.
So, Suhad, you mentioned the media a few times, and and some of the things you refer to, I've given it a name. It's not really a grammatic term, but I call it the passive-aggressive voice. Mm-hmm. So when there's a conflict, the headlines can read, Israel bombed, the IDF attacked, Jewish settlers killed. There's an agent, it's an active voice. But when it's Jews who are the victims, there are no perpetrators. You'll read headlines, settlers hit by a rocket, Sderot under a barrage of fire. Who's doing it? And when the sentence is in the active voice, in naming there's a guilty party, it's usually a gunman or some other vague term. It's rarely, if ever, a terrorist. So you see in these headlines, your conclusion is the rockets are launching themselves. And there's a gunman, maybe from the old west of America. I'm in Chicago, a Chicago-style gunman. And they're shooting it out in Jerusalem. And there's no terror problem here. It's dismissing it.
That's right. And I think there's an overlap both between denying atrocities and dismissing terror threats, because they're basically two sides of the same coin. So on the right, you'll see a media survey or media study that we did in the month after the Indian government abrogated an article called Article 370, which gave Kashmir a special status that made it difficult for the government of India to protect it from a decades-long cross-border proxy terror war by Pakistan. So in the media coverage in the days, by the way, this abrogation occurred through parliamentary process, which is also something that the media tended to ignore because they definitely have a narrative in mind as to who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. But in the month after this parliamentary action, we reviewed 132 articles from BBC, from CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, and NPR between August 5th and September 3rd, 2019. So what we found was that Pakistan was covered credulously and India was covered skeptically. The role of motivation of terror groups, which is the crux of the violence and instability in that region, was downplayed. And despite 95% of the indigenous Hindu population having been cleansed by terror threats, some estimates 350 to 400,000, only 4 of the 132 articles mentioned their cleansing.
So if you are blind to violence, then it's easy to cross the line into violence. We see that the war of words bleeds into actions. I'll give you just a few examples. Unfortunately, there are too many. Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, Muncie are sites of recent deadly attacks, but there have been less dramatic and often unreported ways, assaults against Jews in New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami. We Jews make up only 1.9% of the population, but we are victims of almost 60% of the religiously motivated hate crimes, according to the FBI. And in a report this week, in New York, crimes targeting Jews went up 125% in the month of November. Words matter. The stereotypes become blood. October 27, 2018, Robert Bowers stormed into the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue and shot 17 people, killing 11 of them. Bowers claimed the Jews were engaged in a war against white people when the police apprehended him. And he said they're committing genocide. We heard that trope before. On April 27th in 2019, John Ernst entered the Chabad synagogue in Poway, California on the last day of Passover. He was armed with a semi-automatic rifle shouting, "Jews are ruining the world." He killed one person, wounded 3 others, and afterwards declared, "I only wish I had killed more. I'm honored to be the one to send these vile anti-humans into the pit where they shall remain for eternity." So the Jewish control of the world, the Jewish demons, that was seen in Poway, California. November 2020. A Texas attorney, Georgette Kaufman, was murdered and her husband was shot by Joseph Alvarez, who, in his own words, was aiming to, quote, execute and exterminate Jewish Satan worshipers. So we dare not dismiss hate as mere rhetoric.
It's just jarring that, you know, and I do want to, you know, acknowledge that the scale of Hinduphobia crossing the line into violence is nowhere close to what the Jewish community faces in the United States. However, we have been seeing rises out of the, I think I have 2020 statistics, out of the 1,174 religious-based incidences, as you mentioned, almost 60% of those were anti-Semitic. Anti-Hindu incidents which increased to just 11 separate incidences in 2020 from 8 in 2019. So there are small rises, but again, the scale is quite different. Just this past August, our community witnessed a string of anti-Hindu incidents across the United States in New York, Texas, and California. All of these were actually intra-community, which is all the more disturbing because when you have law enforcement that is unfamiliar with our communities, they don't know the difference between a Hindu and a Muslim, Sikh, they're sometimes not able to recognize that there might be hate that's influencing something that they might just be looking at as vandalism or assault. And a lot of these gripes are over politics in India or affinities people have with separatist movements. And it manifested as violence. A Gandhi statue, statues of Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, have been desecrated and destroyed over the past couple of years. The most recent happening on a temple in Queens, New York. And a Hindu man was slurred, threatened, and spat on just for ordering a bean burrito, which is vegetarian at Taco Bell. And the man hurling, epithets and whatever about being a weak Hindu, a dirty Hindu, et cetera, was another Indian, but of another religion. And in the UK, I think the scale, as we see, has all of a sudden changed. Anti-Hindu violence reared its head this past summer. There was in two areas, Leicester and Smethwick, there was disinformation that was being spread by Islamist influencer handles, insisting that Hindus involved in a post-cricket match brawl were somehow connected with social and political groups in India. And then there was a fake story about Hindu men kidnapping a Muslim girl that were posted, and then they began going viral. These influencers then encouraged people using a lot of rhetoric, anti-Hindu rhetoric about cow worshippers and cow urine drinkers or piss drinkers and whatnot, and gathered crowds who then lay siege on neighborhoods with high concentrations of Hindus and intimidated and vandalized homes, businesses, cars, and temples. I know that as part of our series, we'll be talking to people from the UK, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but these are recent examples of where words cross the line into violence.
And I'm glad to say that HAF and Stand With Us have worked together to introduce Hindu and Jewish groups in the UK to begin shining a light together, as we are trying to do today. Well, we hope you've taken away something that you didn't know tonight, whether it was a positive shared commonality or a negative.
Yeah, Peggy and I definitely have, throughout this process of preparing our presentation, and more broadly as we've worked together, we've learned a lot. Yes. So let's ask the audience then, yes or no, did you learn something new about anti-Semitism or Hinduphobia today? We'll give everyone a few seconds. Peggy, I think we did our job. Over 90 have something new.
Outstanding. So right now I would like to thank the Shine a Light Foundation, our sponsor. I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Thank you, Becca, for your giving me hope for the future. Suhag, I appreciate working with you on this and on everything else we do. And I know that we are just beginning. Do you want to tell them what's coming up?
That's right. Well, before I do that, just want to point to some of the resources that we cited today. We have www.standwithus.com/IRA and HinduAmerican.org/Hindu Hate Glossary if you want to see more of those examples. And
I'm just going to get, and everyone who registered for tonight will get an email, and we'll include those links on the email so that you can look into the materials.
Perfect. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, enjoy may not be the right word, but if you took away some important points that have inspired you to do more, to shine a light on anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia in your own communities, we invite you to join us next week, where we have Carly from Stand With Us and Samir from HAF shining a light on anti-Semitism and Hinduphobia, on what we can learn and how we have responded as respective communities, and what rights we need to know about to better protect ourselves. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.